Um, my name is Francois Frey. I'm with Sigler. I wish to welcome this afternoon our two guest speakers, Professor Brett van Niekerk. He is from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and then Dr. Ramlakan. She is from the University of UKZN, you from DUT. Sorry, my error. He's from Durban University of Technology. We're recording this particular event for those that are online. So Professor van Niekerk will briefly be speaking to us about cybersecurity in the maritime domain, incidents, challenges, and best practices. He's an associate professor in the Department of IT at the Durban University of Technology. He's a non-resident fellow of Sigler. He is also the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Cyber Warfare and Terrorism. He chairs the International Federation of Information Processing, the Working Group on ICT in Peace and War. He participates in international cybersecurity forums, and we're looking forward to listening to him because he's got quite good experience as an academic, as well as on the side of the practitioner with Transnet, etc. So we're really looking forward to Professor van Niekerk to deal with us and share with us some of the experiences, knowledge on data cables, ports, and cybersecurity. Looking forward.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Let me start sharing. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So as Prof mentioned, we'll look at maritime domain. I'll deal more with the incidents, the technical stuff. Dr. Ronan will then deal with some of the legal questions that can emerge out of that. So the main purpose of all of this is just to give an indication of some current incidents that have been occurring in the maritime domain, some of the best practices, and from a legal perspective. Our side as well, it's aligned to a research brief up on the web page. So it is a research-led one, but I decided in terms of my style to make it a little bit more informative for someone to be able to take away and try and actually implement. From my perspective, the maritime domain is a critical infrastructure. So therefore, it has potential both as a target for cyber crime, which is obviously ongoing, as well as potentially for information warfare. Mainly tailored towards the economic damage, but obviously can be used in times of war as well. And I'm just defining the maritime domain as sort of the combination of your ports, the vessels, and I'm including vessels and ships, oil rigs, any ocean going or at sea vessels, as well as undersea infrastructure, because they are all at some point going through various parts of the maritime. And the other side is just a little bit of terminology. I'll try and use the term cyber incident as much as possible because of what's coming up in the legal discussion in terms of what a cyber attack is or cyber warfare. And that is becoming problematic because everyone will just throw around the term cyber attack, cyber warfare, and it's not. There's now a very distinct legal definition of, and countries are explicitly stating where they draw the line of what is a cyber attack or cyber war. Versus obviously kinetic and what's below the threshold there. So just a disclaimer as well. As part of this, there has been some funding from the NRF, which has supported our traveling and some of the work we've done. Okay, in terms of the ports, and I think these have been pretty much the hardest hit, especially since the last few years. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the port of LA in the US saw cyber incidents doubling, reaching around 40 million per month. If you take that, that's quite a few per minute. They don't specifically define what they're seeing as an incident, if it's just attempted incident in terms of scanning, etc., or actually A lot of it is quite persistent, but there is ransomware, malware, a number of other things coming down, or at least in terms of the ransomware, we all know about the transit incident a couple of years ago, which was very problematic across the country. And earlier this year, ports in Japan also was affected by ransomware, both instances obviously resulting in some form of operational disruption. In 2018, San Diego, 2022, Lisbon, also ransomware, but there was no major operational damage there. It was primarily on the corporate enterprise, the web pages, and not to indicate that it can migrate across, or there can be ramifications, even if it's the corporate network onto your operational technology and operational side. And I think everyone now knows about NotPetya in 2017, originally seen as what they thought was ransomware, very quickly reclassified as a wiper because it was essentially a tool designed to do as much damage as possible under the guise of a common strain of ransomware that was found. Cyber espionage can target the ports as well as maritime industry, shipbuilding, and so on. Prime example of ISOC was a key cyber espionage campaign, primarily in Southeast Asia, as well as an example of, again, state actors trying to target the Indian Navy purely to track the aircraft carrier. Subsequently, I think it was about a month ago or 2 months ago, there were attempts at penetrating the US Navy's Pacific Command, specifically for communication. So I presume there the idea is if there was escalating tensions, they would then disrupt communications to try and make command control a little bit more difficult. As well as other state actors being Iran, obviously they are not a top-tier cyber nation, but one that is good enough. They know what they want to achieve, and they manage to achieve it. So they've been targeting in the Persian Gulf cyber and non-cyber means, including things like GPS jamming in the Gulf. GPS jamming has also come across in Southeast Asia, I think South Korea, Shanghai, as well as a port in Europe. There's also been cases of the AIS, automatic identification system, also being spoofed and jammed across some of the ports. So obviously that's fairly problematic, where it is potential, if you have an automated port, equipment that is reliant on GPS, that has been jammed, can't operate. Alternatively, you're pushing down incorrect signals. There is a possibility where equipment might decide to take a swim off the edge of the dock somewhere into the water, as well as the AIS. There's been cases where essentially ghost ships. The British aircraft carrier Queen Elizabeth was seen floating off, according to AIS, on the ship trackers off a coast somewhere, when the video showed it in dock. And there have been cases of foreign warships being seen in territorial waters on AIS because someone has been spoofing either signals or somewhere in the back end of the system. So that obviously in a geopolitical situation is very dangerous. There's two countries that are attention suddenly pick up for foreign warships in your waters. It could result in some form of retaliation. Other things, customs has been a targeted time, primarily by criminals trying to smuggle goods through, once in Europe, once in Australia. The idea there is they could either track their containers or see if the containers are going to be inspected, so they know if it's safe to try and recover any of their contraband. Then obviously normal cybercrime occurs at ports as well as the corporate entities around that, the phishing, the scams, the ECs, also generic malware. Sometimes what you think is normal corporate malware can migrate across to an operating network, the industrial control systems and so on, and causes erratic behavior. From the vessel side, again, growing incidents. There's a lot of research out there saying that vessels are very vulnerable. There have been incidents, again, I think more of a case of bad practice than largely directed from the ship, even though there are some examples. So if you think of the vessel, again, you've got now the modern ship, everything is connected to the internet. So when we use the term Internet of Things, you can think of a ship as a very, very big thing connected to the internet, with a number of smaller things being the normal business network of the ship that you would need, customs, all that type of information, as well as operational technology, navigation, communications, cargo management, power management, safety systems, as well as any ventilation, heating, air conditioning, anything that's required on the vessel. The difference, obviously, is a ship gets affected by malware, it could be out of sea, port, it's easy to get. A ship, not necessarily. Then obviously that gets back to the enterprise network with fleet management system. So malware has cropped up in a number of places, in business networks of ships. They think the drive between the port and the ship has contributed into that. Navigation, communication, in some instances, intrusions have also come into it. Ransomware has been across the board. A case of a cruise as ransomware came into the business network, migrated across the operating network of the ship. As I mentioned, system intrusions. In two cases, actually, in oil rigs, a couple of scary cases. One was the positioning system whilst the oil rig was drilling was hit by malware because of someone plugging into a cell phone where it didn't belong, and it got stripped whilst drilling. Imagine if something went horribly wrong there, it's life as well as ecological results, depending on right. Another system intrusion off the east coast of Africa into an oil rig. So that thing was not commissioned for that now. Malware in also, I think, off Africa's oil rig was so badly infected that it cleaned it up before actually bringing it back into production. So then, as well as, even though it's not necessarily a cyber attack, per se, and I'm using that in terms of indicating malicious activity, there was a case of system crashes and of navigation, a very dangerous one of the US, where pretty much everything went down except for one radar and using that shot in low visibility, high traffic areas. So they had to legally classify that as an incident. So that demonstrates what it is. So if you get the malware into the right place, or if accidentally onto those systems and they crash at the wrong time, there is potential for significant damage there. In addition, obviously, we mentioned GPS spoofing, so you can at sea for piracy purposes. If you can divert the vessel because it's getting incorrect GPS signals in the dark and the context of what they're doing, you can divert it and maybe then try and board the ship. And the specific legal provisions around that are coming up. In terms of your undersea infrastructure, pipelines, cables, and so on, put a big heading there. NATO is getting a little bit nervous, particularly because Russian ships keep on hovering around critical points in undersea cables and pipelines. There has been an attempt in the US, which was successfully prevented in last year. CCOM in South Africa was hit by ransomware earlier this year, but again, corporate intervention didn't go across to the actual core of the infrastructure. But what's actually getting quite interesting now is we're not talking just undersea cables. Microsoft has been testing undersea data centers because you don't need any cooling. They've been doing that I think off Ireland. So now, if we start talking maritime infrastructure, you literally have an entire data center sitting under the water. So you've got maritime law potentially covering that, as well as other IT laws and a number of them. So you're literally the core of the internet sitting under the water, which could have severe ramifications for global internet if those things were damaged through either a cyber or other kinetic means whilst underwater. If the undersea cables, the landing points are very useful spot for espionage sabotage because there are so few of them, and when you look at the actual bandwidth coming into the country, pretty much in South Africa there's 4 points per month. There's significant damage to our internet connectivity just by damaging one of those points. And again, earlier this year, it was a rock slide of the DR took out 2 of the cables, and we could feel that in South Africa. We actually have a bit of a disadvantage when we start talking about espionage. And it's where the Americans are very good. A lot of the traffic routes through, so they can intercept. Same with Russia and their sphere of influence, same with China and their sphere of influence. South Africa is at the end of the cable down the bottom of the continent. So we're not as easily able to intercept everything that flows. But for us as well, the problem is we need those cables alive. In terms of the pipelines, there haven't actually been many cyber incidents for the undersea ones specifically. But we have seen a physical sabotage or alleged sabotage in the Baltic Sea, the two pipelines with the Russia-Ukraine conflict as a backdrop there. And then colonial pipelines in the US, again, demonstrated the significant social consequences of a pipeline outage, where there was mass panic buying across the entire eastern seaboard of the US, and actually declared a state of emergency because of the panic due to that. So you can imagine we have major pipelines under the sea where the pipeline can potentially be compromised. Malware could maybe also one of the valves, and it will be very difficult to manually override that when it's underwater. Then again, we've seen account compromises in a number of some of the large petrochemical companies, particularly in the Middle East. Again, I think Iran was being pushed there. But again, that is something that has a lot of economic influence. So we're looking at it as a coercive action. Is that we can shut down your apartments, we can shut all this down if you don't do this, or we want you to do something else. So that can be seen as a very strong form of economic coercion, particularly in certain states that are very reliant on the state. So from a critical infrastructure perspective, we're talking about maritime. We can't consider maritime as a standalone thing that we can just deal with in a nice little neat box. It's interacted with everything else, the road and the rail to get cargo and passengers back and forth, the crew back and forth to vessels. You need electricity at the port, you need the power distribution, you need water and things coming in. And then obviously also you need satellites. So the space sector is becoming more and more important because that your navigation, your communication, a lot of that is now the backbone of how you navigate. And there is quite a large drive now towards cybersecurity space systems where they're testing of hacking stuff out. I think it was a DEFCON conference 2 years ago that they usually have a hackathon, and it was dedicated towards hacking stuff, both base ground control as well as the satellite itself. And there have been incidents where in the US, I think, National Geographic Institute's satellite weather data was interfered with by the. But ultimately, for our purposes, there is a single point of failure when we're talking about an economic setting, which is the port. That the bulk of the traffic goes through a handful of ports. So if you think about 80% of trade, we have 7 operating ports in terms of cargo. Most of them are sort of tailored towards a specific commodity. Saldanha, obviously the iron ore, Richards Bay coal, Durban containers, and the automotive sector, as well as sort of agricultural. Cape Town, obviously agriculture coming from the winelands and the orchids and series. So you've got very unique commodities, and we can see this overseas as well. That means you can actually affect a specific commodity internationally by targeting a specific port. So if you want to fluctuate prices or something, you disrupt the port. I happen to, well, I need more money, or we find a new deposit, but that bottoms out the prices of the commodity. We can disrupt all the other nations that are selling it. We are now the sole supplier, or at least that commodity, you get preferential treatment because we can supply where the others can't. From an economic perspective, those ports in a information setting are very, very important. Again, with your pipelines, if you think there's one major point of pipeline in South Africa, or Durban, they go all the way up to Johannesburg. So one of the issues if you classify the entire pipeline as a critical infrastructure or fixed protected, but if you forget about the port, where you're actually offloading some of the oil, that's a big problem. Because you protect the pipeline, but if you knock off the port aspect, you're not getting to go into the pipeline in the first place. Now, at the bottom there, the undersea cable, as I mentioned, there are 4 main landing points in South Africa. 2 of them are fairly new. 2 here on the east coast, just to the south of us, and then in KwaZulu-Natal, Mtuvini, just north of Durban, and then Turkey is a fairly new one, just to the south of Durban. So very localized. I think on Mtuvini to Turkey is probably about a drive. You get to Brazil very quickly. You want to sabotage them. So from this, some hypothetical scenarios of where we can go and where the problems could come up. Spoofing of GPS. So that is your automated equipment, as I've already mentioned. Maybe that navigates into the water, maybe it goes into the side of a ship, causes damage to the ship, a bunch of legal aspects around that. What about a ship running aground in a narrow channel? Malware can interfere with a number of systems. As we mentioned, ventilation on the ships sitting far north in Arctic Ocean, suddenly loses your heating, that's a problem for the crew. If it's sitting in Southeast Asia or Equatorial Africa somewhere and you use your air conditioning, that's going to be very uncomfortable for the crew. Now, I know that there's actually been 2 submarine incidents that I know of this year, but we're talking about a ship having navigation systems go out. What happens if the ballast tanks or something goes wrong with the submarine due to malware? It's going to be difficult enough to find a ship when you can see it by satellite, you can get it on radar, you can get helicopters to it. The submarine, you don't know where it is. It's somewhere under the water. So for that crew, it's very, very dangerous. And unfortunately, still some of the things on ships are running Windows XP, which is, how many years out of date now? 5 years, end of life, or more. So that is very, very dangerous. And just another sign of automated mooring systems. We use them in Port Elizabeth because of the winds. They use them in the Baltic Ocean for the ferries between Sweden, Estonia, and Finland. If you interfere with that and they accidentally release the ship, resistant crashes, you're on top. In Durban, a few years ago, we had a shipwreck because of heavy weather, and the picture there shows the result. We've got sandbanks, that ship was lodged there for quite a while. We had the Suez Canal incident because of someone not navigating properly and running the ship aground. It blocked the Suez for a week or more. It had a significant impact. But now with cyber, we can possibly, not through human error, but actually induce those types of incidents by spoofing GPS, AIS, etc. On a port side, what happens if you start causing erratic behavior in the crane or conveyor belt? From a human safety perspective, you shut it down. But now you're not sure what to do with the port. Your operations need to stand still until you know those things are safe to operate. Easy enough, I mean, from the crane, but it's from human error versus because you don't control the system. There's a psychological impact there. So people will try and shut those things down. Another instance of using a ship as a cyber weapon to deliver a cyber weapon to a specific country. We've seen instances of malware being transferred via USB between a ship and a port. So what happens is it's time-activated logic bomb. It activates itself just before a ship arrives at a specific port. USB transfers it across into a country, and then time is over, shuts itself down. So it only targets one specific port or one specific country. So a ship can potentially be a delivery mechanism in a hypothetical form. We've seen the fleet management system was hit by ransomware, affecting, I think, 1,000 vessels in 70 trains earlier this year for one of the major providers. But then what we've also seen in the cyber world in the last couple of years, where systems are actually used in a normal update process for software, are hacked to deliver malware. Now, what happens if you actually use the fleet management system or other connected systems with the ships are connected to, compromise the update or compromise the communication, and use it to push down the malware into vessels to disrupt? so that it could immediately impact thousands in one go. And we see specifically it was SolarWinds a couple of years ago with the network management type of software, where it was actually a very advanced attack. Again, update. It compromised FBI and Microsoft Department of Defenses across the world. They were looking for something very, very specific. They were very disciplined. So if it wasn't what they were looking for, they tended to shut down those connections. But obviously, they were targeting very, very high-profile organizations because they took the time to target. Talking around things like our undersea infrastructure, the cable. This is immediately a problem. You use that exact type of software to manage our undersea cables in terms of the network traffic. You take that, you control the flow of traffic. You can eavesdrop on all of the traffic through those undersea cables. So that is fairly problematic. Same example is, if you, I've already mentioned, fluctuate pressure in undersea pipelines to influence the flow, maybe shut down the valves undersea. Again, manual override should be able to release that, but above ground versus undersea, it's a bit more difficult to try and recover from that. So some best practices. Now, I've been mentioning the whole way through the whole concept of your operational network as well as your corporate network. And that concept is very important. Those two need to be separate as much as possible. And I've mentioned things like single points of failure. So the ports, the landing points for undersea cables, and so on. So when everyone's into a risk assessment, that's right. But how to do the risk assessment? We need to start worrying about things like what is the key facility within our trade ecosystem, within our military system. That if we affect that specific facility, we're going to have a problem. So, for instance, for the Navy, it will be Simon's Camp, obviously, because that's the headquarters. For Transnet, obviously, if you fit Durban Harbour, that is a lot of the trade. And this is essentially what's happened. So you've got key facilities around, but within those facilities, you have key components or key assets that if that system dies, you're pretty much still dead in the water. And people also think when you do risk analysis, okay, cool, we'll check this system here. So we'll check the critical system, but we forget about the other system in the background that it relies on. You still need to be able to log into those things, you still need to work with it. So if you kill off all your access control to your IT network, those systems are still going to have a problem. And they're still not going to operate properly. So we tend to, unfortunately, look at, we'll do a risk assessment here or there and pinpoint a few key systems, but we forget about the enterprise system when we're looking at operational technology, and we forget about operational technology when we're looking at enterprise systems. And essentially, they are all kind of connected to some form of network, and we need to worry about that. Obviously, that risk analysis is very, very important. We need the engineers from the operational technology on board to look at that from a cyber means as well. And there's other cases of industrial control systems going haywire because of radar testing, sensor systems freak out. The protective and detective controls are put in one line there, which probably is 90% of what we do in cybersecurity in terms of those controls, the monitoring, the detection, and so on. But that's kind of broad. So it's on a case-by-case risk assessment will determine what we should be putting in terms of that. But what's important is segregating the operational from the corporate aspect in some mechanism. It can be by putting a firewall in between the two, an air gap in between the two, which means physical and logical segregation, but you still need information transfer. And that's where flash drives a bit of a pain because that's what you use to transfer information across. So what we have then is a clean machine where you try and make sure the flash drive is disinfected before taking it onto the operational network. Air gaps have been jumped using flash drive. The Stuxnet in Iran was an example of that. It jumped across into the operational network. It could scout around, and then next time the flash drive gets plugged into the operational network, puts information back into the flash drive, gets copied onto the corporate network, and sent back home for monitoring and command control. But it's important to at least try and segregate these. I understand that there is a need for remote control access because of vendors, because of a number of things, maintenance, and so on. But you need to do so securely and using a degree of logic. Strong authentication. Make sure everyone has login and you control those logins. You have indirect access. So it's not a case of, oh, I need access to that system, so I can just log in and it goes straight into the back end. You just bypassing on the security. Have what's known as a jump off. So you log into another server that allows you access, very controlled, so you only access certain systems. You can't let migrate across the network and do anything. And then the other side is, and this is where people get it severely wrong, is regular reviews to remove unnecessary connections. The problem is you create a connection for a vendor or somebody else, vendor leaves or contract ends, something like that, and you forget to remove the connection. If you look at the majority of the cyber or the data breaches in South Africa, how many of them are third parties? Pretty much all of them. The actual organization, somebody else that is working with the data or has access, is the source of the breach. So if you're giving someone else access to your network, you have to strictly control it, and as soon as it's no longer needed, you get rid of it as soon as possible. Otherwise, they get breached, it's one hop into your network. The other side is a management thing. First level agreement. Again, we're migrating more into a legal aspect here, but one of the problems is people assume that. Great, we've got a vendor, so don't worry, they'll deal with the security. Are they really dealing with the security? Where is it in the contract? I think it explicitly states it there, it's not there. So they think it's being dealt with, and it's not being dealt with. Badly worded SLA. I came across an instance once where, oh no, don't worry, it says the top 10 cyber threats. But how do you define top 10 cyber threats? By quantity, by severity of impact, by persistence. So that they're looking at the top 10, but they miss something that's very severe because someone else may be looking by quantity, which is just noise on the network, where it's nothing necessarily significant. So that is something very, very important. Security by design, we're putting all these things on the internet, ships, operational technology. We need to design from the ground up with security in mind. Otherwise, you're going to realize a few months down the line, this thing is on. The problem is Internet of Things, people are not connecting anything they can get their hands on onto the internet. You can get a connected mouse tracker. But that's not a vulnerable point if you don't secure it properly. And they're not designed with security in mind. And unfortunately, again, this is a mechanism. People think that if something is high-tech, it is secure. Not necessarily. Because you haven't designed it for security. You designed it for another purpose. As soon as you focus on putting the purpose, you forget about security, embed it into an organization, and it introduces responsibility. The other important part is the incident response plan. When something goes wrong, what are you going to do? How are you going to fix it, and how are you going to recover from it? When we start talking about ships, when you're in the middle of the ocean and something goes wrong, you need people there to understand what they're looking at and how to try and recover those things. A port, you can call somebody in. In a ship that's 300 nautical miles off the coast, and we're not entirely sure where it is anymore, if it's beyond radar range, then, and no one can fix those systems, you've got to get someone there. If the communications are down, how do they call for help? That becomes problematic. So we need to train literally everybody who will need to be dealing with some form of response to be able to do so adequately. But we also need other people that you don't think of in a normal cybersecurity context. What about corporate communication? You have clients, you have customers, you have stakeholders, etc., that are now getting rumors of something going wrong. And we can use the content example as a key point of it. So we were seeing even the strain of malware before they were officially acknowledged as a cyber incident. We had the government say, yes, it is a cyber incident, and we're going to investigate it because it was a week after the riots in KZN. So that they put that linkage together. The content at that point had not actually acknowledged it was a cyber incident. So you've got miscommunication. Another example is earlier the DoD. There was data leakage and apparently hackers came in. First communication was fake news. Then they said, no, we're investigating, so that got retracted. Then the statement was, no, we weren't hacked, it was a criminal syndicate leaked our data. But it just happened to be a cybercrime international syndicate in another country. So the likelihood we got hacked. But that kind of communication and the backwards and forward doesn't look good. So you need that kind of training, you need corporate communication to be able to communicate upfront. At the same stage, you don't want to over-communicate. One of the mobile providers communicates, oh, we've been hit by a DDoS attack. Now everyone knows that it's underway, and all the malicious people all jumped on board and made it work. Next time they alert, they didn't communicate to me. We have an issue after the fact. We said, okay, it was a denial of service attack on it. You need HR because if your systems go down and you can't pay salary, you need to engage with employees and so on. Maybe it was an insider that did something malicious. And there's no disciplinary action that needs to come in. Legal, obviously, are your contracts. How do you fulfill them if the systems aren't working? This is why I trust very quickly at the case force majeure. Because 1 week after a riot where the trains and things were affected, we're now down for a week or two due to a cyber incident. So very, very quickly they take force majeure to try and circumvent legal consequences because of it. And again, I indicated the awareness of all employees, I've mentioned this already, but you need to, the common person in the organization, how do you identify if something is wrong? Who do you report it? So that's the first line of defense. If they see something and don't report it, it could start. And it could be something weird, like the mouse is just moving around on the screen and clicking away by itself. I think, well, this is weird, and they wait for it to finish and leave. Next thing, you see a payment of a few million being made. Again, the bridge crew and the ship, very, very important. That's sort of like the critical part of the ship. They need to understand what to do to try and recover those. How the backup. If you're going to restore from a backup, you need to realize that if it's not clean and you restore from backup, you kill your backup. Then you've got nothing left. This is one of the biggest flaws in incident response. We try and recover too soon from a backup, either from an unclean backup, in other words, the malware is already there but dormant, or alternatively, it's not cleaned properly and the malware hits again and you lose all your backup. During the NotPetya incident, most managed to recover because, luckily for them, there was a few servers in Africa somewhere that were down because of power failure. That was the only loss survived. They had to rebuild, I think, around 40 to 45,000 desktops and around 4,000 servers from scratch. They had to rebuild. And they were lucky because they had one in Africa that was down to be able to pull the configuration. That was pretty much everything else. Then again, obviously, you need to make sure people understand what they need to do in an incident. What is their role? And who are the backups around it? So we know, we practice, we make sure that we can recover from any cyber incident. Just like in the military, you would make sure you are prepared for any eventuality in the situation you need to be. And unfortunately, what life is like, it will throw you something completely unexpected in. Best practice documents, I've just listed down there. We won't go into too much detail for time's sake. That there are a number specifically for maritime. Some are in the briefing. I've added a few more, like the NTS ISAC is a maritime information sharing analysis center in the US. They do have international presence as well, so threat analysis, etc. And they've got a few other documents. The International Maritime Organization has got a number of things, primarily around risk assessment for ships, etc. Ironically, they've also been targeted during the pandemic quite a few times by cyber. I think twice in a month or so at one point. FIMCO is in the Baltic. They've got also a very useful guide. And for a cybersecurity person, common sense things, but they've tied nicely to ships. So these systems you need to look at and give examples based on those. Then the other cybersecurity documents are out there still apply to the sector. Just because it's not dedicated to maritime or transportation doesn't mean it isn't relevant, because that is still the basis of what we're looking at. And A lot of them are fairly common, like the ISO IEC one are common standards. SABS, our Bureau of Standards does use those as well. I think their versions are maybe a couple of years later than the original. The cybersecurity framework globally is very common. There are a few for industrial standards. MITRE attack framework, very useful. It actually gives you various stages and different attack techniques that you can map to various offensive techniques. GSP advanced cyber stability. Dr. Robertson will talk a little bit more, but there are norms of how to protect the core of the internet, so related to undersea cables. 2015 UN group of governmental experts, again, norms around state behavior in cyberspace. So what is allowable and what is not allowable. Things like we shouldn't kill certain critical infrastructures like power, finance, and so on. Then particularly the Italian manual, which is geared towards safe cyber operations, got a whole section on the maritime sector as well. So there's a couple of Dr. Omicron will do the majority of the legal aspects. So just in brief summary, pretty much we've seen impacts of undersea infrastructure, the ports, the vessels, everything due to cyber inconformity, and it's increasing rapidly, both by cybercrime as well as state actors. We've seen trade being disrupted. We've seen potential for specific commodities being affected. In Iran, some of, firstly, the ports, but then still their iron and steel sector has been affected as well as the railway. So there is a specific, across the entire supply chain, giving cyber looks like a specific commodity or their ability with a commodity is being affected. We have also in Iran seen specific targeting of their nuclear development across the board with cyber. So obviously, the whole thing is we need to follow the best practices, both that have been put out by the various maritime organizations, but as well as the conventional one. And we need to make sure it's done for both our normal enterprise networks as well as operational networks. Because unfortunately, that's where the money is made sometimes in the maritime sector. And that's also sometimes we get the case of there's that one critical component that's somewhere between IT and the operational network, and the time is spent blaming each other instead of fixing the problem, which is why we need proper practices and so we know who's responsible to fix these things when they actually break. So that's just a quick overview, and then we'll hand over to Dr. Ramakan with illegal access.
Professor Fanika, thank you for this. This is often what they refer to as hidden infrastructure, hidden threats that touch our daily lives, and we just don't realize it. So thank you for this. So next, Dr. Trishana Ramlakhan. She is the research manager at Typical Holdings, an honorary research fellow in the School of Law at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, prior to which she was a postdoctoral student at that institution. She's a member of the IFIP Working Group on ICT Uses in Peace and War. She's an academic advocate for ISACA, and in 2020 she was listed as the top 50, one of the top 50 women in cybersecurity in Africa. Dr. Ramlakhan, please, looking forward to listening to you.
Thank you, Scott. Good afternoon, everyone. So my section is very brief because I'm going to be mainly focusing on something called the Italian manual. So I'm going to be looking at the legal considerations for maritime cybersecurity. A brief introduction, as Prof. Fanika already explained, ports, ships, maritime supply chains, everything that is affected by a cybersecurity or can be affected by a cybersecurity attack. Everything, including ports, ships, maritime supply chains, remain vulnerable to cyber attacks. So the international maritime industry relies on cyber systems for all aspects of operations, management, and sometimes face cyber attacks from so-called activists, terrorists, and transnational cyber criminals. So just briefly, we're going to look at the IMO, The IMO is the International Maritime Organization, and they have a guideline which was created from basically the sinking of the Titanic, and it was amended to include cybersecurity. This was an extension of SOLAS, and SOLAS is the safety of life at sea. Then I'm going to look at the UN Convention of Law of the Sea, which basically states your territorial sea at 12 nautical miles, your exclusive economic zone at 200 nautical miles, and then your high seas, which are greater than 200 nautical miles. Then I'm going to look at the Talent Manual 2.0, the 2015 UNGGB norms, which reflects on the responsible space behavior in cyberspace, and the GCSE, the norms for protecting the public core of the internet. There are some concepts from international law. I am looking at it as maritime law as a subset in terms of cybersecurity under international humanitarian law. Some just basic concepts. Sovereignty, this applies to warships, and jurisdiction refers to the flag nation for ships. Then we have interference, use of force, and the armed attack, which may lead to physical damage or injury. So jurisdiction is a little bit tricky. And then the concept of use of force. The use of force is defined in the UN Charter, I think it's section 2, subsection 4. And I'll get to that a little later. And the armed attack, which also becomes a little bit contentious. Then I'm going to look next at attribution. Attribution reminds me of someone trying to chase their tail. Very difficult to prove attribution because you need to find reasonable evidence. And the concept of proportionality, you can see an image there, more like a heavy-duty image, is how can you react to a cyber attack, which also becomes a major legal issue. Local laws and regulations do apply. I think in South Africa we use the ECT Act, and we do use RICA in terms of interception. Sometimes there is a problem with RICA because some sections were deemed unconstitutional, but it still remains in place. Some points to consider. So who is responsible if a ship causes damage to a port due to a cyber incident? Who is responsible if a ship is damaged while under the pilotage or docked due to a cyber incident? So do we look at it in a reactionary way as in a recourse in terms of legalities? And it comes down to responsibility and accountability as well as jurisdiction. And if a ship can't offload due to a cyber incident. If we look at vessels at sea, they have a responsibility to deliver cargo. If a ship system, if the system crashes due to a cyber incident, or say that there is a spoof GPS, could this mean piracy or collision, or it could lead to piracy and collision? The more detailed aspect is addressed in the Talent Manual 2.0, and they have certain rules that may apply. There's a few more rules that do apply, but these are the key rules. Rule 45, cyber operations in high seas, allowable for peaceful purposes. Rule 46, the right to board is suspected using cyber attacks or whatever for piracy, slave trade, or unauthorized broadcast. Rule 54 states, okay, there's a number of sections here. So there's sections 3 to 5, state sovereignty applies to cables in territorial waters And the thing is that the reason that I've used the challenge manual is it's much more detailed and it's non-binding, but at the same time, it actually gives a proper guideline relating to cyber attacks at sea. State laws and regulations apply to laying and maintenance. However, states need to respect existing cables in their waters laid by others that do not make landfall. Section 6 to 8, states may lay cables in the exclusive economic zones and continental shelf of a coastal state with due
details of amount is 1,557.
Okay.
Section 10, states have the right to lay cables beyond the continental shelf. Section 11 states landlocked states have the right to access, which is a curious one, but basically it states that even if you're a state that is landlocked, you should have access to the ports. Section 15, it is prohibited for states to damage undersea cables. So the channel manual is actually very detailed. It does lay out the guidelines of what you are allowed to do and what you are not allowed to do. And this is when we look at cybersecurity, the channel manual is actually very important under international humanitarian law, even though it is an authoritative document and not a legislation. Then we have the GCSC norms for protecting the public core of the internet. And this may apply to undersea cables as a major component. So I'm going to have a brief discussion. So we're going to look at spoofing of your GPS. In the territorial waters or ports, state legislation would apply. Responsibility becomes difficult as any damage arising is not the fault of the ship operator or the nation or port authority. You have to possibly consider an armed attack if serious damage or injury occurs. On high seas, it can be considered interference or use of force. An armed attack would be considered if it causes damage or injury. And that also may include economic damage. Potentially a breach of freedom of navigation. So previously the challenge manual does state that you do have access to the ports, etc. Preventing people from accessing the seas becomes an issue because it means you're being breached in terms of freedom of the seas or navigation in the seas. Malware impacting a ship in high seas affects freedom of navigation and ultimately puts lives at risk. Attribution remains problematic. The responsibility remains the shipping operator. Then we have espionage or interference of undersea infrastructure in territorial waters, and this is considered a breach of sovereignty. So in South Africa, we don't have much legislation regarding maritime cybersecurity. We do fall back on ECTA, which is your Electronic Communications Act, and we can, to some extent, use RICA for prevention of interception. But I think I know there was a workshop held for the development of a maritime cybersecurity policy or strategy going forward. That is still in process. Clarity and guidance is required for the interference of navigation, responsibility, and liability due to cyber incidents under South African law. An example is reporting cyber incidents as a danger to navigation. There is the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act. However, this also does not explicitly consider cyber. The Cyber Crimes Act may apply, It was previously known as the Cyber Crimes and Security Bill. They have removed the security part and just left it as the Cyber Crimes Act. Responsibility for a cyber incident can include a malicious actor, negligence of an insider, and failure of governance. Failure of governance is actually an important one. In South Africa, while we are part of the AU, we are not, or we have not adopted the Malabo Convention, which is also an important one, because apparently it is breach of sovereignty and that may not apply or may not comply with other legislation. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Dr. Ramlakan, thank you very much for this. I listened with interest because navigating the legal aspects, well, to put it very mildly, and you really need the specialists to be able to do that on the maritime side, related to our discussion earlier today about how do you draw this kind of expertise to South Africa to build up a base of human capital that can navigate or master this. So from my side, I want to ask if there are any questions. I first want to ask the in-person audience. Do you perhaps have any questions for the speakers? If you could just put up your hand, state your name, and direct the question at the speaker you wish to answer. Professor Nel.
Michelle, I was listening. Thank you for a very, very interesting presentation. First of all, I was looking at the best practices and looking at your hypothetical scenarios. And I don't know if this is maybe too general of a question, but how prepared do you think we are to mitigate these challenges? Because I mean, there's a lot of issues, and I look at the best practices, and I don't know to what extent they are implemented, but do you think we are in any way prepared to mitigate these risks?
I think sector by sector it varies. So some sectors are a little bit more prepared. So if we look at the banking finance sector, we've got SABRIC as the Banking Risk Information Center, and they really have adopted quite a bit of some cybersecurity type resilience there. They also advise in general to the public on cybercrime and so on. I think where we start falling short sometimes is still that expertise on the operational technology side of security. And when we looked at the response from the government to the transit cyber incident, different government departments had their own plan of how to try and solve the problem. But you can see they weren't talking to each other. One wanted a list of experts, but it kind of is one if you look in the right place. One of the others, you know, I can't remember, they were trying to build up something else. But we do have a national cyber security. We do have all the bits and pieces, but to try and bring it all together sometimes is a little bit problematic. And getting the right skills in the right place. But ultimately, I think this is what is important is, again, going back to the good governance. That has to be in place. Because you could have the experts there, but if they don't have something to fall back on, essentially they're going to go rogue in trying to solve the problem and potentially not succeed. They won't have the support. For cybersecurity, you need to see the senior people taking the lead as well. Because there is it has to be an organizational culture. And if you don't see the senior people taking the lead, then it's just not a lot of training we have to go to, we don't care, and we don't realize how bad it impacts people. This is why when we did cybersecurity training, we didn't make it about the organization first. We made it about the individual first. How does it affect you, and how does that translate into the business? Because when they realize, okay, fine, I mustn't click on this thing because in 2 steps, the criminals can steal your money out of your bank account. When they start realizing that and start practicing good behavior, it translates back into an organization. So I think that that is one of the things. We obviously do have a general shortage of skills. Globally, there's a shortage of cybersecurity skills. And they're talking in the order of millions. And now we start talking about specialist things like operational networks, maritime specific sector. And so it's just going to compound that issue. But I think preparedness for South Africa, we need to look at, we've got the National Cybersecurity Hub, which aids to a certain degree, but we need to move forward into proper threat intelligence, like some other nations are doing. We need to build up the skills in certain critical areas for operational technology, because that's where we're getting some of the economic impact that we're not really seeing. And it's not mandated to report those because there's no necessary privacy breach. So we don't actually fully know the full state of impact. There are a number of South African examples around operational technology that you find in obscure literature that people never hear of. So it's happening. We just don't get to hear about it. And we don't know what the impact is. If there's a privacy breach now because of Nokia, it's all over the news. So we know that, but we don't understand the economic impact behind some of it. Unless it's direct, measured by through fabric on the finance sector. But you're not going to measure the transit impact on that. That was significant because it's multiple orders of magnitude. It's transit itself. There's the farmers who couldn't export the citrus fruit because they needed cold storage. There's a few steps down the line that actually has an economic impact. And I think we need to start looking at this at national, where the I think the Australians are very good. That they've got a engagement with cyber technology and critical infrastructure, interlinking very strongly with cyber security. Currently, our legislation they kind of talk to each other. So yes, you have a cybersecurity advisory council, and someone needs to understand critical infrastructure. You have a critical infrastructure advisory council, and someone needs to understand cybersecurity. Okay, great. There's no beyond that. There's not huge interlinking. You still have under critical infrastructure that I think the Minister of Police gets to this one of the critical infrastructure. But then, are the police well enough equipped to make that decision? Shouldn't we have a separate cybersecurity department dedicated for it and introduce like the American ISAC? It's under Homeland Security, CISA, and Infrastructure Security Agency. It's very, very good. It's because the two are so strongly interlinked. They do election security. They do basically Homeland Security. All the sort of national security aspects to that. Then obviously intelligence agency and military deal with the foreign stuff. But if we have an agency like that, then I think we would be far more mature and prepared. Again, the political will to get that going is the glitch. Okay.
The second question from the in-person audience, please.
Thanks for the presentation, but then my name is Manakoda. So from the curriculum side, from the curriculum perspective, so I'm just wondering in terms of how far we are in terms of starting from the basic, from the basic education, going up as well. Are we actually doing something as South Africa?
Yeah. Generic answer, we're doing stuff, but maybe not enough. Some of my colleagues do teach cybersecurity to both teachers and students at school level, but I think more the high school. But even through the universities, if you look at South Africa, again, I think it's our educational structure that's somewhat problematic, that it takes sometimes 2-3 years for a new degree through all the red tape to get it going. So we don't have many dedicated cybersecurity. I think we might have modules here and there. But I think we're aiming at, we do need to focus more at a lower level, especially children who are now engaging more and more technologies than we would have at our age. They need to understand the threat, even basic threats, not to click on things at random and not to talk to strangers on the internet. Like we teach them not to talk to strangers in the real world, it has to apply into the internet as well. And then also the other side is in basic education, what do the teachers know? The teachers are a major role model or input into the development of the next generation. They need to be able to advise as well. They need to be able to understand that. So I think that is a gap that we're missing. For a lot of the research around the cyber awareness, we'll look at a school or a university at the student. We forget about the educator. And unfortunately, quite often we come across in certain environments, oh yeah, just do this. And unfortunately, those are us advice. So do not do that. That's a very bad idea.
Okay, we've got an online question from Mrs. Noel van der Wacht-Cowling. Noel, you can unmute and put your question.
Thanks, Prof. Thank you very much, Brett and Shoshana. Very, very good presentations. Brett, my question's to you, and you spoke quite a lot, obviously, about Transnet, because this is a maritime topic that you're dealing with. So my question relates to Transnet specifically as an entity that carries so much infrastructural risk for South Africa in terms of ports and rail, and then, of course, pipelines. Do you think that government has been realistic in terms of the amount of support that an entity like Transnet actually needs in the cyber domain, that it's actually almost impossible for them in terms of their own revenue to have the type of cybersecurity budget and support resources that they require? Do you think they need more help from the state on a more national level, like if we had a proper cybersecurity centre, just in terms of the risk that this poses to South Africa? That's my question.
Yeah. So I won't go too much detail into some of the aspects, but Transnet, if you look at Transnet's positioning in South Africa economically, Transnet is a single point of failure. It's got your rail, it's got your ports, it's got your pipelines, all interlinked. So if your central Transnet systems go down, governing all of that, your entire trade chain breaks. So you're left with what we can actually access with coal and so on. You can't get the fuel in. We're already using more oil than we need to because of Eskom's load shedding. So if you break Transnet, you can't get any trade in or out. You've got serious problem, serious economic damage. And this is if you look at internationally, when you talk about incidents, the port of, because each port is almost a separate entity. But in South Africa, we have Transnet, which is all the ports and most of the trade routes. Also, okay, so there are one or two other terminals that are privately managed in South Africa, but the vast majority is controlled through Transnet. So again, this is what we saw when an incident hits there, pretty much all your infrastructure for trade is brought to a standstill. In terms of support, obviously, cybersecurity is one of those things that's very difficult to motivate for money because it's a negative return on investment. Is people look at it and say, well, nothing happened, so why do we need to give you money? So it's one of two things: either nothing happened, or maybe we're doing our job. But for a board person, no, cybersecurity is never going to say no to money. And I think nationally, not only Transnet, but the others as well, we need to pump more money into it. And this is why I suggested, like I said, whilst we've got the National Cybersecurity, but it's supposed to be a coordination center, we've got SABREC, but we don't have the other sector-based requirements. So we need one for transportation, is critical. We need one for the energy, and I think they will overlap to a certain, or at least that critical infrastructure. Eskom, Transnet, one or two others, with a dedicated cybersecurity capacity to assist them, which will help maybe spread the funds across not one organization, but multiple. Whereas I don't think anyone would say they've ever got enough money in the cybersecurity. Unfortunately, I've got a brilliant thing on the WhatsApp like 5 minutes before starting, so I can add it into the slides. But it was like a picture of King Arthur, a round table, like the security team that we would like to have, and the next frame is Monty Python nights going, the security team that we're forced to have because of the budget. So I think, yeah, we do need more funding. And it's not only in South Africa, it's across the developing world as well, where there are other priorities that governments need to deal with. and that sometimes detracts from the cybersecurity. But I think there needs to be more attention still, because that is becoming more and more problematic in terms of not just the crime and the economic disruption, but societal impact as well. That some of the other malicious nonsense coming through on like riots, etc., and certain behaviors that people learn online is problematic. Then if we go on a completely different tangent, what artificial intelligence is doing. But we do need that support. And again, looking back to basic education, we need to bring that support right down to grassroots levels and build it up through the major organizations.
And thank you for that. Unfortunately, we're pushing over our time. So I'm going to stop the recording, and I want to